Order. The Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, meeting 146. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, study of ethical aspects of artificial intelligence and algorithms. Today we have with us as individuals as witnesses Marc-Antoine Delac, Professor, Philosophy, University de Montréal. Christian Sandvig, Director, Center for Ethics, Society and Computing, University of Michigan. And that will be in the first hour. And as we all know, we're going to discuss in camera, pursuant to Standing Order 108, the briefing by the law clerk of the House on briefing on the power of committees to summon witnesses. That'll be our discussion following this. So go ahead. We'll start off with Marc-Antoine for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon. And thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you a few reflections on the ethics of AI. I've been asked to explain and present the Montreal Declaration, which was developed in 2018, and I'd like to begin with that document. First of all, a very general overview. The current technological revolution will profoundly change the structures of society by automating both administrative processes and the decisions that stem and will have consequences for human life. The choice architecture, as determining our options by default, will transform lifestyles and attitudes with the personalization of various recommendations, access to health tips online, automated, and planning tools in real time, etc. This technological revolution is a major opportunity, unprecedented in its nature, to improve public service, to correct injustices, and to respond to the needs of each individual and each group in society. We have to seize this opportunity before digital infrastructure is completely deployed, after which time there will be very little margin for maneuver. In order to achieve this end, we should first of all identify the ethical principles which guide the development, responsible and sustainable development of these technologies, including AI. Then develop standards, regulations, and appropriate legislation. The Montreal Declaration for the Responsible Development of AI, we've proposed an ethical framework for the regulation of the sector dealing with AI. While this is not binding, it aims at developing the standardization of legislation in regards to AI. The ethical framework constitutes the basis for human rights in the digital age. I'll briefly explain how we came to develop this declaration. It might be of some interest when we see what, in a democratic society, the use of AI, and I will try to follow up with a few reflections. The process, of course, stems from a multi-stakeholder consultation. It was an initiative undertaken by the University of Montreal, but largely supported by the Fonds de recherche du Québec, Quebec Research Fund, and other organizations, including Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. A great number of disciplines were represented in this multidisciplinary group: philosophy, ethics, social sciences, urban design, law, medicine, and of course informatics. This group, the university group, established a consultative process based on the citizenry in order to draw benefit and advantage from their innate knowledge of society and their everyday lives. The process was launched in February 2018. We organized over 20 public events, workshops, focus groups over a course of 8 months, principally in Quebec, in Montreal and Quebec City, but also in Europe, including Paris and Brussels. Over 500 persons participated in one or another of these face-to-face workshops. We've also prepared an online consultation process. This citizens consultation is based on a robust prospective protocol. The participants and stakeholders were invited to these workshops, based on the scenario that the digital society was very soon forthcoming. Now, it was a very broad consultation. Why did we choose that rather than to try to do an in-depth subject matter experts only? Well, the first reason is that AI will, in fact, have consequences for all of society down to its deepest roots, and everyone has the right to express an opinion on its deployment. It's a democratic exercise. The second reason is that there are some ethical challenges which are very complex, which involve a number of values, particularly in our society, which is multicultural and quite diverse. We can't just depend on an expert opinion on the deployment of artificial intelligence. Experts can clarify some of these stakes, and they can try to establish some rational approach to which conditions should be debated and used, but they have to develop the solutions in collaboration with the civil society. The third reason is that a participative process is one way to support the public trust in the process and in the deployment of AI. If you want their trust, you have to make sure that they have faith in those major agents of change in AI and involve the public in the conversation. This is a necessary, this is absolutely required but insufficient reason. Involving the citizenship, we also need to involve the industry. But we can't let them hijack the process. The possibility is quite high, and it would only hinder the development of AI. Now, a few comments on the content of the declaration. The purpose of our consultation was twofold: to develop the ethical basis and to develop recommendations as to the public policy. The result of this process of participation resulted in a very long, complex declaration with over 10 basic fundamental principles, 60 other methods, and 35 public policy recommendations. Among these fundamental principles, that of the well-being, autonomy, protection of privacy, solidarity, which we don't find in too many other documents, democracy, equity, diversity, responsibility or accountability, and public satisfaction. They are not arranged in any priority ranking. The last is as important as the first, and depending on circumstances and context, one principle might be more significant than another. If privacy and protection of privacy is deemed to be an issue of human dignity, the protection of privacy, has to sometimes be infringed for medical reasons. If it would improve the individual's health and well-being, and if the collection and use of personal data are submitted to individual consent, for example, the principle of FPIC. So this is not just a checklist. This allows us to develop standards and methods to ensure proper implementation. Privacy, or the concept of privacy, would be different if we're dealing with a medical issue or if we're dealing with a legal issue. The process, the declaration also has a basic approach in law. Similar declarations, Declaration of Helsinki in bioethics, are in fact non-binding. They enumerate a number of principles and agents for the development of AI. And now we have to convert these into standards that can be applied by industry for the deployment of AI in public administration as well. And the conversion and translation of these principles into digital processes for the population at large, which would eventually be implemented throughout Canada. And I thank you very much.
Marc-Antoine, next up we'll have Christian Sandvig for 10 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee. To frame my remarks before I begin with the substance of my comments, I just want to say that my position is that we are at a moment where I'm delighted that the committee is holding these hearings. We're at a moment where there is increasingly widespread concern about the harms that might be possible as a result of these systems, meaning artificial intelligence and algorithms. And so I thought what I could offer to you in my brief opening remarks would be some sort of assessment of what might governments do in this situation. So what I'd like to do with my opening statement is to discuss 5 areas in which I believe there is the most excitement in communities of researchers and practitioners and policymakers in this area right now. So I'm offering you my assessment of these 5 areas. Many of them are areas that you at least preliminarily addressed in your earlier reports. But I think that I have something to add. So the 5 areas I'll address will be: first, I will address transparency. Then I will address structural solutions. Third, I will address technical solutions. Fourth, I will address auditing. And fifth, I will address the idea of an independent regulatory agency. So I'll start with transparency. By far the most excitement in practice and policy circles right now, having to do with particularly algorithmic automation, centers on the idea that we can achieve justice through transparency. But I have to tell you, I'm quite skeptical of this area of work. Many of the problems that we worry about in the area of artificial intelligence and transparency are simply not amenable to transparency as a solution. One example is that we're often not sure that the problems are amenable to individual action. So it is not clear that disclosing anything to individuals would help ameliorate any difficulty. So, for example, a problem with a social media platform might require expertise to understand the risk. The idea of disclosing something is in some ways regressive because it demands time and expertise to consider the sometimes quite arcane and complicated intricacies of a system. In addition, it might not be possible to perceive the risk at all from the perspective of the individual. There's a tenet of transparency that we need to be sure that what is revealed has to be matched with the harm that we hope to detect and prevented. And it's just not clear that we know how to match what should be revealed with the harms we hope to prevent. Sometimes we discuss transparency as a tactic that we use so that we can match what is revealed to an audience that will listen. And this is often something that is missing from the debates right now on transparency and artificial intelligence. It's not clear who the audience would be that we need to cultivate to understand disclosures of details of these systems. It seems like they must be experts, and it seems like deconstructing these systems would be quite time-consuming, but we don't know who exactly they would be. A key problem that's really specific to this domain that is sometimes elided in other discussions is that algorithms are often not valuable without data, and data are often not valuable without algorithms. So if we disclose data, we might completely miss an ethically or societally problematic situation that exists in the algorithm, and vice versa. The challenge there is that you also have a scale problem. If you need both the data and the algorithm, it's often not clear just in practical terms how you would manage a disclosure of such magnitude, or what you would do once you received the information. Of course, the data on many systems also is continually updated. So ultimately, I think you've gathered from my remarks, I'm pessimistic about many of the proposals about transparency. In fact, it's important to note that when governments pass transparency requirements, they can often be counterproductive in this area because it creates the impression that something has happened, but without some effective mechanism of accountability and monitoring matched to the transparency, it may be that nothing has happened. And so it may actually harm things to make them transparent. The second area I'll discuss, an example of a transparency proposal that's gotten a lot of excitement recently would be data set labels that are somehow made equivalent to food labels. So nutrition facts for data sets or something like that. And there's some interesting ideas that there would be a description of biases or ingredients that have an unusual provenance. Where did the data come from? But the metaphor is that tainted ingredients produce tainted food. Unfortunately, with the systems that we have in AI, it's not a good metaphor because it's often not clear without some indication of the use or the context what the data are meant to do and how they will affect the world. Another attractive, exciting idea in this space of transparency is the right to explanation. That is often discussed, and I agree it's an attractive idea, but it's often not clear that processes are amenable to explanation. So even a relatively simple process that doesn't have to be in a computer, it can be the process by which you decided to join the House of Commons. It might be a decision that involves many factors, and simply stating a few of them doesn't capture the full complexity of how you made that decision. And we find the same things with computer systems. The second big area I'll talk about is the structural solutions. I think this was actually covered quite well in the committee's previous report, so I'll just say a couple of things about it. The idea of a structural solution might be that because there are only a few companies operating in some of these areas, particularly in social media, we might use competition policy or antitrust to break up monopoly power, and that, by changing the structure and incentives of the sector, could lead to amelioration of any harms we foresee with the systems. I think that it is quite promising that if we change the incentives in the sector, we could see changes in the harms that we foresee. However, as your report also mentioned, it's often not clear how economies of scale operate in these platforms, and without some quite robust mechanism for interoperability among systems, it's not clear how an alternative that's an upstart in the area of social media or artificial intelligence, or really any area where there is a large repository of data required, would be effective. I think one of the most exciting things about this area might be the idea of a public alternative in some sectors. Some people have talked about a public alternative to social media, but it still has this scale problem, this problem of network effects. So I guess we could summarize that area by saying we are excited about the potential, but we don't know exactly how to achieve the structural change. One example of a structural change that people are excited about that is more modest is the information fiduciary proposal, where a government might regulate a different incentive by just requiring it. It's a little challenging to imagine because it does seem like we are most successful with these proposals when we have a domain with strong professionalization, like doctors or lawyers. The third area I will discuss is the idea of a technical solution to problems of AI and algorithms. there's a lot of work currently underway that imagines that we can engineer an unbiased, fair, or just system, and that this is fundamentally a technical problem. And while it's true that we can imagine creating these systems that are more effective in some way than systems that we have, ultimately it's not a technical problem. Some examples that have been put forward in this area are the idea of a seal of approval for systems that meet some sort of standard that might be done via testing and certification. And this is definitely an exciting area, but only a limited set of the problems we face would fall into the domain that could be tested systematically and technically solved. Really, these are societal problems, as the previous witness stated. The fourth area I'll introduce is the idea of auditing, which I saw mentioned only briefly in the committee's last report. The auditing idea is my favorite. It actually comes from work to identify racial discrimination in housing and employment. The idea of an audit is that we send two testers to a landlord at roughly the same time and ask for an apartment. The testers then see if they get different answers. And if they get different answers, something is wrong. The exciting thing about this area is we don't need to know the landlord's mind or to explain it. We simply figure out if something is wrong. And there's a lot that legislatures can do in the area of testing. They can protect third parties who wish to investigate these systems, or they can create processes akin to software's bug bounties, but the bounties could be for fairness or justice. So this is, I think, the most promising area that governments can use to intervene. Finally, I'll conclude by just mentioning there is also talk of a new agency, a judicial administrative law or commission agency to handle the areas of AI. I think this is an interesting idea, but the challenge is that it just postpones many of the comments I made in the earlier parts of my remarks. We often would imagine such an agency doing some of the same things that I already discussed. And so the question then becomes, what is different about this area that requires processes that are not the processes of the legislature and the standard lawmaking apparatus, the courts that we already have? The argument has been made that expertise makes this different, but it's hard to sustain that argument because we often do see plain old legislatures making rules about quite complicated areas. I'll conclude there, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your testimony. We'll start off with 7-minute questioning rounds. We'll start off with Ms. Vandenbel.
Very much. Thank you, both of you, for very informative remarks. I guess one of the things that I have been wondering about, and actually, Professor Dilhatch, you mentioned this when you talk about involving civil society. It's that for most people, this is a very misunderstood area. For people who are not technical experts, and even I would imagine for some technical experts, first of all, you have popular culture myths around artificial intelligence that go back for decades. Many people aren't aware of how prevalent it already is in our day-to-day lives. And so if you have systems where you involve civil society, or you involve legislators, or you involve people who are not technical experts to oversee this, how do you ensure that you're not then taking the biases that exist in these systems and the biases that exist in public and just replicating all of those once again and amplifying the same bias?
Merci pour cette excellente question.
Thank you for this very good question. There is no silver bullets for this kind.
L'idée, c'est de faire
The basic concept would be to be working together. Civil society, experts in informatics, experts in social sciences and philosophy and ethics, and some of the leadership from the industry. There's not one source of expertise that's going to take over. We have to combine all of these various perspectives together with a proper dialogue, a proper discussion and negotiation to reduce these biases, to reduce potential prejudicial adverse effects, particularly among the most vulnerable. And why? Well, this discussion will allow to rationalize the debate. Perhaps it's my philosophical bent that wants me to say, well, it has to have a rational approach. But when you're in a parliamentary assembly, if you're dealing with a workshop in a public library where we had many of our meetings, dialogue will allow you to rationalize and comprehend in a proper sense the arguments and to properly align the thinking.
Professor Sandvik, did you want to respond to that?
I'm happy to defer to my colleague.
Okay, thank you. Going back to what you said, Professor Sandvik, about transparency, because this is something that we've heard a lot in this committee, that if people know where the data is coming from, if they understand how the algorithms work, that this would allow a certain amount of oversight, as it does in many other areas. You're suggesting that transparency alone would not actually have that effect. In order to have audits, in order to have a regulator, obviously the information needs to be available, even if you were to audit that information. So is it what you're saying is that we need transparency, but in such a way that we know who the who is actually going to be reviewing? Or is it the public that, in general, civil society that would have to do that?
Thank you very much for this question, because I think it exposed a weakness in my own explanation. So in the social science literature, they use the term audit, but they don't use it in the financial sense. So the audit simply describes the process I outlined, where two testers, say one black and one white, or one woman and one man, ask a landlord for a room or an employer for a job. And they call that an audit, but it's quite confusing because obviously the tax authorities also have an audit and it means something else. So I think the reason that audits are exciting to me is you can have an audit without transparency. Remember that I said you don't get to see the inside of the landlord's brain. So that's why the audit is exciting, because we can audit platforms like Facebook and Google without transparency by simply protecting third parties like researchers, investigative journalists, and civil society organizations like NGOs who wish to see if there are harms produced by these systems. To do that, they would act like the testers in my example. So they would act as users of the systems and then aggregate these data to see if there were patterns that were worrying. Now, this has some shortcomings. For example, you might have to lie. Auditors lie, right? The people who go in to ask a landlord for a room don't actually want a room, right? They're testers working for an NGO or a government agency. So you might have to lie. You might have to waste the landlord's time, but not very much. Usually on systems like large internet platforms, it's hard to imagine that an audit would be detectable. And it's possible that you provide false information that makes it into the system somehow, because you aren't actually looking for a job. You're just testing, right? So there are definitely downsides. As I mentioned, you also need some sort of system to continue after your audit finds there is a problem. So for example, if you found that there was something worrying, you would then need some other mechanism like a judicial proceeding involving, say, some disclosure. So you could say transparency comes later through another process if you needed to really understand how the system works. But you might never need to understand that. You might just need to detect that there is a harm and tell the company they have to fix it, and they're the ones that have to worry about how. So this is why I'm excited about auditing, because it gets around the problems of transparency.
Professor Dilech?
Oui, je pourrais ajouter quelque chose. Alors,
Yes, I might be able to add something on transparency. I think we've underestimated the issue of transparency here. And this method or any mechanism which would test an algorithm, for example, serves to identify perhaps any given problem. I would also use the sense of audit in both its senses, and as was just explained, but also to examine the algorithm more closely, to try to see which are the problematic parameters and determinants causing the problem.
Est une excellente.
I do believe that the solution put forward earlier is a very good way to go.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you both for your participation today. I'm just wondering, Professor Sandvig, with regards, when you talk about regulation, many uninformed, many lay observers, many with concerns about what they read, what they hear about algorithmic use and AI, may feel, and sometimes I certainly feel it, given some of the testimony we've heard, for example, about Cambridge Analytica, hearing about some of the big dataopoly use of AI to affect and direct consumer retail attitudes, social attitudes, and so forth. Is there an element of being a little late to put some of the smoke back into the bottle in terms of regulation? Can some of the inappropriate or unethical applications of AI and algorithms to date be reverse regulated? And I would throw that to both of you, but Professor Sandvig first.
Well, I think my background before going to graduate school is as a software engineer, and my memory of the time as a software engineer fits with what many commentators are saying now, that software engineering does not have a safety culture. It does not have a culture that we would analogize to industries like, for example, airline travel. And so I guess the question is, can we imagine changing something that's big and that's already happened and making, what looks like, you mentioned recent revelations about Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, changing something that looks extremely bad to something that looks extremely safe. Like, again, I used air travel. But I think it's possible. I mean, I can't imagine that the Wright brothers had a safety culture, right? There was some way in which government regulation started slowly and accreted, and we have an industry that's regulated, and that we now consider perhaps the Max 8 as an exception. We now consider this industry as to be a safe industry, and we're not concerned about air travel. And I would say this is the trajectory that we need for these industries. We need a sense where it's the role of the government to make sure that the public is safe, and we can do that with social media if we did it with other dangerous things.
Well, you gave the example of the 737 MAX 8. Is that a failure to audit after the first tragedy?
Well, a hearing on airline safety, so you'll forgive me for saying I'm not sure. But I think in general, I would point to the level of comfort that people currently have with air travel as my main point. And even despite the MAX 8, I think that we could imagine something like that for social media platforms or artificial intelligence. And we're currently very far away from it. So I don't mean to at all minimize your concern. I mean, recent news reports show that many of these companies are at rock bottom in terms of consumer trust in their operations or customer satisfaction. I mean, really below even any other industry. We're looking at some of the most hated industries.
Professor Dillatch?
Oui, alors, par exemple, dans la Déclaration de Montréal, un des principes, c'est la prudence. Et l'idée...
One of the principles is caution, prudence. Going from there to talking about security and reliability criteria for algorithms is the next step. but not just algorithm. I'd like to extend or broaden that term somewhat, because what matters is how the algorithm is fitted into a system. When you have an algorithm, there's an entire system around that algorithm, other algorithms, databases, the way it is used in a very specific context. So, for example, if an individual user sits in front of a screen using a given platform, it's one thing. But when the algorithm is applied in a major corporation or in an airline, in an aircraft, that's totally different. So what's important is the reliability of the entire system, not just of the algorithm. So we need to see how the data are used, what kinds of decisions are made, and what kind of human control there is over the decision-making process. I therefore feel it's very important for algorithmic systems, not just the algorithms themselves, but the algorithmic systems be properly audited, in that the whole architecture of the system would be carefully examined in order to identify any potential failings that the system might have. With aircraft, since you gave them as an example, you mentioned the 2 tragic accidents with the MAX 8. We would need to ensure in advance that human beings maintain control. Even though human error is a factor, that's not at issue here. Yes, human beings make mistakes, and that is why we have algorithmic assistance. But saying that, or what is important to ascertain, I should say, is to keep the error with the human side of the equation. But examination and careful audits are essential in finding the faults in an algorithmic system.
Social auditing of AI development and algorithms, we know that, and we've seen the negative impact on assembly lines, for example, the negative impact on labor, as some companies rush to either save their business plans or to maximize new profits by relying on AI technology. So how do both of you feel in terms of the acceptability or the necessity of a certain amount of social regulation to ensure societal stability in important areas of the labor force? Professor Professor Delage, you can go first.
Okay. Les changements sociaux.
Social changes are extremely difficult to control through legislation or regulation. When we say technological revolution, we have to take the term revolution seriously. There are structural changes involved, and trying to control that sort of transformation, in my opinion, is not reasonable. What does seem reasonable, to my mind, is establishing mechanisms such as training procedures, mechanisms that make it possible for the digital shift in society to include all those who will be required to change their skill sets. So the idea is not to put more pressure on businesses and stop them replacing human beings with algorithms. They might regret having done so in the end, but that is not actually the best way of moving ahead. By contrast, providing training, making sure that there are mechanisms in place, and that is somewhere where governments can intervene, making sure that support can be provided for transforming those skill sets. That's important.
Next up, for 7 minutes, Mr. Julie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our guests. Unfortunately, I arrived a little late and therefore did not have an opportunity to hear your opening statements. I apologize for that. And I apologize if I'm asking questions that you've already answered. The question I had at the outset is one regarding legislation and the regulatory framework governing artificial intelligence. Should Canada have legislation and a regulatory framework to govern the ethical uses of artificial intelligence? What examples can you give of how other countries or regions have established a regulatory framework, or what kind of legislation do they have to govern AI?
Je vous le pose à
The question is for both of you. Perhaps Professor Dillac might begin. There are many regulatory initiatives underway in the world. The European Union has just produced an ethical and standardization framework with recommendation, with assessment criteria. But it has rarely gone so far as legislation. There are instances where a legislative framework might indeed be useful, and Canada can regulate some algorithmic activity, for example, those pertaining to data. Data are the food of algorithms, as it were. So a framework that governs the use of data can be legislative, and here it is legislative. There is legislation that could be passed to govern the use of data in education, AI in education. How robotic do we want education to be? It is creeping in, and the day that it's fully here might be too late to legislate. If you have a robot that's monitoring the performance and trajectory of pupils, that robot, when I say robot, it's because we're talking about a robot interface that's algorithm backed. The robot makes decisions that monitor the student. Now, to what extent do you want to pin a student into a trajectory that's been decided by an algorithm and is constantly monitored and assessed by an algorithm? Excuse me, I apologize for interrupting. You're talking about a robot monitoring a student, but why would a robot do that? Because it would make it possible to personalize education. So if a given student has specific difficulties, the algorithm can identify them very quickly through the pedagogical process and can then adapt the pedagogical process and the content of learning activities to that student. This is still lagging behind in North America, but it's certainly widely used in Asia, China, and South Korea. I'm talking about what's to come. There was an education summit recently in Montreal, and 1,500 people attended, so things like this came up. The issue of medical decisions. Who makes medical decisions? It is up to Parliament to make that decision. It is up to Parliament to decide because it is a doctor's responsibility in assessing risks and in setting diagnoses to make certain decisions. These are just a few examples. There are many more. Thank you. Mr. Sandvik?
I think I'm in sympathy with remarks made by my colleague. I mean, I think maybe what I can add is that it's hard to foresee specific legislation in part because we don't have a good definition of what we mean by artificial intelligence. It's really a loose term that covers all kinds of different things, even ideas within it that we're particularly concerned about, like machine learning, that idea, that term is itself a loose term that covers a variety of approaches that are quite different. And so I think one of the challenges for us is the success of computing, because it has meant that things that look like artificial intelligence are all kinds of things, and they are in all kinds of domains. So I think it's more likely that we will see legislation that specifically addresses a context and a use of technology as opposed to an overarching principle. A colleague of mine said that we are at peak white paper. We might be at kind of near peak principles as well. There are many statements of principles, and these are valuable, but I think our task is to translate these into specific situations rather than to legislate all of AI, because I just don't know how to do it. There are some exceptions, though. I mean, there are a few areas where we might see overarching legislation that's of value. One example would be that this committee has done some important work on the Cambridge Analytica scandal with its previous report. One of the challenges of that scandal for many countries around the world was that they had taken an approach to communication that said that social media platforms essentially do nothing. So many governments, as you know, provide immunity to liability for online platforms or social media companies as conduits. And they did that in a very blanket way. I mean, we could say it's a terrible mistake of the United States. And so this is an area where you have one legislation that affects a huge swath of activity, because it affects sort of all use of computers to act as intermediaries or conduits between humans. And the idea that you would just give away freedom from liability, it seems like a bad one. So there are some areas where there could be sort of broad legislative action, but I think they're rare, and it's more likely we'll see domain-specific approaches.
Thank
you.
you,
Do I
Mr.
have a
Julian.
moment?
We're past time already.
Okay,
So
thank you.
next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Thanks very much. Thank you to you both. The last answer actually is a useful segue. So in terms of regulation that could apply more broadly, we have obviously in the GDPR algorithmic explainability, and a right to sort of explainability, as was referenced in some of the opening comments. This committee has recommended a level of transparency and ability of a regulator to look under the hood at times and assess whether that transparency has been sufficient. Obviously, Mr. Sandvig, you've expressed some skepticism about transparency, though that does appear to me at least to be an initial step that would apply more broadly in a way that the next step might have to be sector specific. So I guess I want to drill down on some of the skepticism and with respect to transparency. So you didn't mention algorithmic impact assessments in your opening comments, and I wonder if the detail and the detailed work that is now being put into formulating AIAs is a better answer to transparency.
Well, I mean, I think I'm going to remain skeptical about transparency, because I think that algorithmic impact assessment isn't a transparency proposal. I think that those proposals are, as their title implies, they owe a debt to environmental impact assessment. And there may be elements of transparency required in producing such an assessment, but I think I didn't mention them in that section, in part because I don't see them as predominantly a transparency approach. I mean, I think I'd be happy to give you additional skepticism about algorithmic impact assessments, though. I think the challenge of them for me is that we might group the negative harms of algorithms and AI into two groups, and one group we could say is foreseeable, and one group we could say is not foreseeable. And I'm afraid that the second group is quite large. So the algorithmic impact assessment stuff that I've seen really takes for granted that it's possible to have some assessment. And when we look at many of the scandals involving computer systems, artificial intelligence, and algorithmic systems, a number of the scandals, although not all, but a number of the scandals seem to involve things that no one would have wanted. So it could be that an impact assessment process caused the developer or required the developer to think more carefully about the system and produce a different one. But it might also be that some of the results we're seeing are hard to imagine being foreseen at all.
So
and
let
so
me,
I just
let me though
worry
jump
about
in so I think you have to accept that there is a transparency aspect to this, because when we look at, and I'll use the example, so in the public sector at the moment, and this is very recent for the Government of Canada, but there is a questionnaire that any department that is employing automated decision making needs to fill out. It's 80 some odd questions. Based upon the answers to those questions, they're assigned basically a level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 in terms of the risk. And then there are measures that need to be taken, some additional notice requirements, or some, they have to obtain perhaps experts to peer review the work. But in the initial impact assessment itself, there are questions about the purpose of the automated decision making that they intend to employ, the impact that it's likely to have on a particular, whether it's individual rights, whether it's the environment, whether it's the economy, we could argue about the generality of it and whether this could be improved. But it seems, on the one hand, to both provide a transparency mechanism in that you are requiring disclosure about the purpose of the algorithm and potentially the inputs to the algorithm and its benefits and costs and potential externalities and risks, and then 2, depending upon the outputs to that assessment, there are additional accountability mechanisms that could apply. And I guess my question is, if you look at, and if you haven't looked at yet, my question would be, if and when you do take a look at the Canadian model for the public sector in more detail, is that something that you could transcribe and treat it more like a securities filing, and to say, this is going to be required for private sector companies of a certain threshold, and any non-compliance where material terms are excluded purposefully or in a negligent way, then there are penalties for non-compliance. And would that be sufficient to meet at least the baseline transparency accountability generally before we get into sector-specific regulations?
Well, I absolutely will agree that there is a role for transparency somewhere. I just am afraid of it as a proposal because it promises, I think, more than we can expect it to. So I agree with that. The issues, I think, are, let's look at a particular example. In some of the algorithms that this committee was concerned about when writing its prior report, we know that there are already patents available that give broad outlines to how the algorithms work. The issue is that really, for example, the Facebook newsfeed, Facebook in public disclosures that are already made says, well, our newsfeed, it used to brag that it was a computation made based on 3 factors. And then as the years went by, they said dozens of factors. And then they said hundreds of factors. And I think we're now at over 300 factors. So there's some value in disclosing these factors, but it's not clear there's that much.
But not just in disclosing the factors, I guess, is my point would be, so when we have Richard Allen, the VP for Global Policy at our international committee in London last fall, and he says, if speech crosses the threshold for hate, obviously we should take it down. But if it's right up against that line, maybe we shouldn't encourage and promote it. And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, obviously you shouldn't promote that kind of content, but that's the algorithm and that's the newsfeed algorithm to promote reactions, regardless of what those reactions are, even if they're negative reactions. They're looking for eyeballs, not looking for much beyond that when they want to generate profit. So if there's an algorithmic impact assessment and we're setting the rules of what that assessment should entail, it's not just about, I agree with you, there's an element of transparency and disclosure. It shouldn't just be about the inputs necessarily. A company should have to come to terms with what are the potential adverse effects as well, I think, and have to put that in such an assessment and have to turn their minds to that. Do you think that is a useful and additional layer of accountability and transparency?
Yes, I absolutely do. Yeah, okay. I do. I think I just worry that this other, I don't know how large the category is that won't be addressed by it. So this is what why I am skeptical, but not that it is not a valuable proposal in itself.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thanks. I just have to give everybody notice. I know normally we have lots of time to discuss this, but we only have time for 2 more 5-minute questions, and then we have to get into the discussion about the legal advice on the summons. So just wanted to forewarn you about that. So we have Mr. Gord and Mr. Picard up. So first of all, Mr. Gord for 5 minutes.
Merci, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ethical issues with all these new platforms is that individuals don't all have the same awareness or the same level of acceptance of artificial intelligence. For example, I'm not bothered if somebody knows my favorite color or what kind of car I drive, but some people would be absolutely appalled if that was public, and they don't want anything to be known about them on some platforms. But I think in many ways it's too late because there are so many new tools. The private sector is acquiring tremendous volumes of personal data on us, and that volume of data is growing every year. They can practically predict the date we'll die. Mr. Dileg, you said there was a lot of regulation and not much legislation. And it's very difficult, of course, to establish legislation when AI doesn't stop at the border and platforms don't stop at the border. So how do we protect people? The balance we need to strike is the balance between the law and the contract. In AI development and deployment, in applications, it's the contract that wins out. We don't have time now to go into the details of contracts. You know, when you run through the agreement and it says accept, not accept, you don't read it. But if you really sit and look at the fine print, you will see that it requires you to accept all kinds of things that are absolutely unacceptable and should not be in a contract. For example, we're talking about Facebook. We looked at the terms and conditions of using Facebook. Facebook gives itself the authority to hold your data from third-party applications. If you're online on Facebook, regardless of whether you're logged onto Facebook or not. So in other words, Facebook reserves the right to look for data on you from third-party applications, even when you're not logged onto Facebook. And that kind of thing is perfectly doable. And if you agree as a user to allow that, so too bad for you. But this should be legislatively regulated. And that balance is not easy to find, but that is a parliament's job. What needs to be in a contract between a service provider and a user, and what needs to be legislated. There's a great deal to do, but I think one priority for public protection is to seriously tackle the use of data. It's not just your favorite color that's important, but maybe one day if you stop liking blue, an algorithm might decide that you have a mental problem or you have some pathological condition you're unaware of, and then things might become much more difficult for you. Thank you. Mr. Gord, Mr. Picard.
Thank you. My question will be first to the professor and then to Mr. Sandvik. Artificial intelligence, of course, is not very well known by the public, and the public is quite concerned or perhaps even afraid of it. They see it only from a negative light in many, many cases. However, at the beginning of last century, we survived the introduction of the Industrial Revolution and then the computer revolution in the 50s and 60s. Is there any way of comparing these three revolutions on their in the terms of their impact on society, whether it's social and economic? And can there be any lessons to be drawn, whether what not to do or positive lessons? Or is there some incompatibility between these three technologies? Yes, there are a number of unknowns. And of course, if one were to be humble, we don't know exactly where we're going with this AI. Now, looking backwards in time, there are some touch points. The Industrial Revolution allowed us to advance very quickly. However, but the beginning of the 19th century, now that's 2 centuries ago, the part that was, it caused a century of torment, of wars, of revolutions, civil revolutions, thousands and thousands of deaths, if we were to take a look at the overall picture. And it's a very complex situation. One lesson we do draw is that progress can be had with these technological tools. However, we have to plan for a transition. Schumpeter, as you know, economist, spoke of the creative destruction. We destroy something, disturbance, to arrive at a better result. But it takes time, and perhaps we don't like the word destruction. So today, we try to control some of the conditions in which there's going to be the fewest losers possible, where the disruption could be minimized, because we can have some exceptional process, not only in medical terms, for example, with this technology, but in any other number of fields. We have to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. Mr. Sandvik?
Assessment, I think, big question.
Okay, second question then. Who will decide what will be the norms when you create such AI software or system? Because actually, if the norms are established by the corporate entities, we're going to end up in a business type society. I don't think that's the way we want to go. So a wise man, a wise woman somewhere that we have all to, that we should recognize, everyone. I didn't find one yet, not in government. Who's it going to be? Mr. Sandvik.
Well, I mean, I think it sounds like I don't have a specific answer for you, to be honest, because I think that it's exciting to me that you're asking the question, because I worry that many people believe that they don't see an alternative to technologies that come somehow out of nowhere and then they are subject to. So I'm excited by the idea that these are not corporate and that these are things that we all have to decide as a society. As to how to achieve that practically, I think this is quite challenging. We can endorse the principle of democratic participation, for example, given in the Montreal Statement. How do we achieve that? There are some models. There's the Scandinavian model of participatory design. There are ideas, but I think still currently we look at a landscape that is dominated by, you know, what has been called big social monopoly computing platforms, AI, and it's hard to see exactly how you will have a voice in it. So I think I'm hopeful that some of the proposals that I discussed in my opening statement and that previously we were in your last report about structural changes to the industry might provide openings for which we see another kind of participation. For example, public alternatives.
Monsieur Tillac, en conclusion?
Oui, pour la...
Well, standards, who would develop and who makes the choice on these standards? My answer will be possibly negatively leaning. if it's done strictly by the private sector or the industrial sector, this is what we're seeing today. It's self-regulation. They have a responsibility, a duty, not to find all the solutions, of course. To find a solution, you have to identify the problem correctly. But they do have a responsibility to take in hand a discussion, a debate, a dialogue on these choices, whether it's businesses, commercial enterprise, corporations, professional societies, civil society organizations. It has to be a multiplicity of stakeholders and participants. And everyone must assume their responsibilities. No one is an innocent bystander in this.
This is today. I know it's something we could talk about for a lot longer than an hour. So we appreciate your time today, and we're just going to briefly suspend while we'll go into camera, and we'll have our witnesses, Mr. Dufresne, come up. But again, thank you and appreciate your contributions today to our committee. So we'll suspend briefly.